Read the letter to the Romans. Read the whole thing. St. Paul says, the just judgment of God, who will repay everyone according to his works. Did you hear that?
Is Paul really saying that we're justified by works? In Romans 1, Paul is arguing that God is angry at all of humanity. Naturally, the Jews in Rome agree with Paul, saying, of course, the Gentiles are sinners before God. But in Romans 2, Paul begins to apply this teaching to say that, no, universally, everyone is a sinner, and this includes the Jews. And therefore, Romans 2 verse 6, God will render to each person according to their works. And Paul really stresses his point. The Jew first, then the Greek. In other words, the Jews don't get to escape this judgment. But Paul is not saying this because he's commending to the Jews that they need to seek their justification by their own works. He's pointing this out so that the Jews will see they're in the same predicament as the rest of the nations, even though they themselves have God's law. The Jews think that they're going to be helped because they were given God's law, but Paul points out, as he's already said, having the law will not help them because they who boast in the law dishonor God by breaking that same very law. And thus, as Paul points out, he's already charged that both Jews and Greeks are under sin. In other words, what the Jews need to learn is that the entire point of the law is so that every mouth may be stopped before God and held accountable. Because by works of the law, not a single human being, Jew or Greek, can be justified, since we've all broken the law in some way. So perhaps we're asking, well, what hope is there? And that's the entire point of chapter 2. Not to commend being saved by works, but that those who have the law would see that the law condemns them as well because they cannot keep it by their works. So the good news of the gospel is that the righteousness of God has been made manifest or revealed, made available apart from works of the law because it's been made available through faith. That is, all who trust in Jesus. In other words, Romans 2 verse 6 is not saying that we're going to be justified by our works. It's making the point that apart from faith, you're in big trouble. Because if everyone's going to receive judgment according to their works, well, your works testify that you are a sinner before God. Thus, Paul concludes in Romans 3 verse 20, by works of the law, no human will be justified. Thus, the hope of followers of Christ is that we hold that one is justified apart from works of the law. In other words, the antithesis of being saved by works is that we are saved by faith in the one whose works have made us right before God. So what do you do if you look at your own life and you recognize, hey, you've broken God's law? Well, the answer isn't a set of good works to appease God. Instead, it's to place your trust in Jesus Christ, who lived perfectly in a way that you never will and offered himself up to atone for your sins. And by trusting him, his righteousness is put on you, and your sin is credited to him, and he died for your sin, so that you could be at peace with God.